Conclave by Robert Harris. Read by Matthew Jones. 1. Sede vacante. Cardinal Lomeli left his apartment in the palace of the Holy Office shortly before 2 in the morning, and hurried through the darkened cloisters of the Vatican towards the bedroom of the Pope. "O Lord, he still has so much to do, whereas all my useful work in your service is completed. He is beloved, while I am forgotten. Spare him, Lord, spare him. Take me instead." He toiled up the cobbled slope towards the Piazza Santa Marta. The Roman air was soft and misty, yet already he could detect the first chill of autumn. It was raining slightly. The prefect of the papal household had sounded so panicked on the telephone, Lomeli was expecting to be met by a scene of pandemonium. In fact, the piazza was unusually quiet, apart from a solitary ambulance parked a discreet distance away, silhouetted against the floodlit southern flank of St. Peter's. Its interior light was on, the windscreen wipers scudding back and forth, close enough for him to be able to make out the faces of both the driver and his assistant. The driver was using a mobile phone, and Lomeli thought with a shock, "They haven't come to take a sick man to the hospital. They've come to take away a body." At the plate-glass entrance to the Casa Santa Marta, the Swiss guard saluted, a white-gloved hand to a red-plumed helmet. "Your Eminence." Lomeli, nodding towards the car, said, "Will you please make sure that man is not calling the media?" The hostel had an austere, antiseptic atmosphere, like a private clinic. In the white-marbled lobby, a dozen priests, 3 in dressing gowns, stood around in bewilderment, as if a fire alarm had sounded and they were unsure of the correct procedure. Lomeli hesitated on the threshold, felt something in his left hand, and saw he was clutching his red succhetto. He couldn't remember picking it up. He unfolded it and placed it on his head. His hair was damp to the touch. A bishop, an African, tried to intercept him as he walked towards the elevator, but Lomeli merely nodded in his direction and moved on. The car took an age to come. He ought to have used the stairs, but he was too short of breath. He sensed the others looking at his back. He should say something. The elevator arrived. The door slid open. He turned and raised his hand in benediction. "Pray," he said. He pressed the button for the second floor. The doors closed, and he began to ascend. "If it is your will to call him to your presence and leave me behind, then grant me the strength to be a rock for others." In the mirror, beneath the yellow light, his cadaverous face was grey and mottled. He yearned for a sign, for some infusion of strength. The elevator lurched to an abrupt halt, but his stomach seemed to go on rising. He had to grip the metal handrail to steady himself. He remembered riding with the Holy Father in this very car early in his papacy, when 2 elderly monsignors had got in. Immediately they'd fallen to their knees, stunned to find themselves face to face with Christ's representative on earth, at which the Pope had laughed and said, "Don't worry, get up. I'm just an old sinner, no better than you." The cardinal raised his chin, his public mask. The doors opened. A thick curtain of dark suits parted to let him through. He heard one agent whisper into his sleeve, "The Dean is here." Diagonally across the landing outside the papal suite, 3 nuns, members of a company of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, were holding hands and crying. Archbishop Wozniak, prefect of the papal household, came forward to meet him. Behind his steel-rimmed glasses, his watery grey eyes were puffy. He lifted his hands and said helplessly, "Eminence." Lomeli took the archbishop's cheeks in his hands and pressed gently. He could feel the younger man's stubble. "Gianno, your presence made him so happy." Then another bodyguard, or perhaps it was an undertaker, both professions dressed so alike. At any rate, another figure in black opened the door to the suite. The little sitting room and even smaller bedroom beyond it were crowded. Afterwards Lomeli made a list and came up with more than a dozen names of people present, not counting security. 2 doctors, 2 private secretaries, the master of papal liturgical celebrations, whose name was Archbishop Mandorf, at least 4 priests from the apostolic camera, Wozniak, and of course the 4 senior cardinals of the Catholic Church, the Secretary of State, Aldo Bellini, the Camerlengo, or Chamberlain of the Holy See, Joseph Tremboli, the Cardinal Major Penitentiary, or Confessor-in-Chief, Joshua Redeemi, and himself as Dean of the College of Cardinals. In his vanity he'd imagined that he'd been the first to be summoned. In fact, he was the last. He followed Wozniak into the bedroom. It was the first time he'd seen inside it. Always before, the big double doors had been shut. The Renaissance papal bed, a crucifix above it, faced into the sitting room. It took up almost all the space. Square, heavily polished oak, far too big for the room. It provided the only touch of grandeur. Bellini and Tremboli were on their knees beside it with their heads bowed. Lomeli had to step over the backs of their legs to get round to the pillows where the Pope lay, slightly propped up, his body concealed by the white counterpane, his hands folded on his chest, above his plain iron pectoral cross. He was not used to seeing the Holy Father without his spectacles. These lay folded on the nightstand, beside a scuffed travel alarm clock. The frames had left red pinch marks on either side of the bridge of his nose. Often the faces of the dead, in Lomeli's experience, were slack and stupid, but this one seemed alert, almost amused, as if interrupted in mid-sentence. As he bent to kiss the forehead, he noticed a faint smudge of white toothpaste at the left corner of the mouth, and caught the smell of peppermint and the hint of some floral shampoo. "Why did he summon you when there was still so much you wanted to do? Sub venite sancte die." Redeemi began intoning the liturgy. Lomeli realized they'd been waiting for him. He lowered himself carefully to his knees on the brightly polished parquet floor, cupped his hands together in prayer, and rested them on the side of a counterpane. He burrowed his face into his palms. The Nigerian cardinal's basso profundo reverberated around the tiny room.
"Receive his soul, and present it in the presence of the Most High."
The words buzzed in Lomeli's head without meaning. It was happening more and more often. "I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer." Some kind of spiritual insomnia had crept over him during the past year, denying him that communion with the Holy Spirit he'd once been able to achieve quite naturally. And, as with sleep, the more one desired meaningful prayer, the more elusive it became. He confessed his crisis to the Pope at their final meeting, had asked permission to leave Rome, to give up his duties as dean and retreat to a religious order. He was 75, retirement age, but the Holy Father had been unexpectedly hard on him. "Some are chosen to be shepherds, and others are needed to manage the farm. Yours is not a pastoral role. You are not a shepherd. You are a manager. Do you think it is easy for me? I need you here. Don't worry. God will return to you. He always does." Lomeli was hurt. A manager. Is that how he sees me, he thought. There'd been a coldness between them when they parted. That was the last time he saw him.
"Eternal rest grant unto him, Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him."
When the liturgy had been recited, the 4 cardinals remained around the deathbed in silent prayer. After a couple of minutes, Lomeli turned his head a fraction and half opened his eyes. Behind them, in the sitting room, everyone was on their knees with their heads bowed. He pressed his face back into his hands. It saddened him to think that their long association should have ended on such a note. He tried to remember when it had happened. 2 weeks ago? No, a month, 17th of September to be exact, after the Mass to commemorate the impression of the stigmata upon St. Francis. The longest period he had gone without a private audience since the Pope had been elected. Perhaps the Holy Father had already started to sense that death was close, and that his mission would not be completed. Perhaps that accounted for his uncharacteristic irritation. The room was utterly still. He wondered who would be the first to break the meditation. He guessed it would be Tremboli. The French-Canadian was always in a hurry, a typical North American. And indeed, after a few more moments, Tremboli sighed. A long, theatrical, almost ecstatic exhalation. He is with God. He stretched out his arms. Lomeli thought he was about to deliver a blessing, but instead the gesture was a signal to his two assistants from the apostolic camera. They entered the bedroom and helped him stand. One carried a silver box. "Archbishop Wozniak, would you be so kind as to bring me the Holy Father's ring?" Lomeli rose on knees that creaked after 7 decades of constant genuflection. He pressed himself against the wall to allow the prefect of the papal household to edge past. The ring did not come off easily. Poor Wozniak, sweating with embarrassment, had to work it back and forth over the knuckle. But eventually it came free, and he carried it on his outstretched palm to Tremblay, who took a pair of shears from the silver box, the sort of tool one might use to deadhead roses, thought Lomeli, and inserted the seal of the ring between the blades. He squeezed hard, grimacing with the effort. There was a sudden snap, and the metal disc depicting St. Peter hauling in a fisherman's net was severed. Sede vacante. The throne of the Holy See is vacant. Lomeli spent a few minutes gazing down at the bed in contemplative farewell, then helped Tremblay lay a thin white veil over the Pope's face. The vigil broke up into whispering groups. He moved back into the sitting room. He wondered how the Pope could have borne it year after year, not just living surrounded by armed guards, but this place, 50 anonymous square meters, furnished to suit the income and taste of some mid-level commercial salesman. There was nothing personal in it. Pale lemon walls and curtains, a parquet floor for easy cleaning, standard issue table, desk, plus sofa and 2 armchairs, scalloped backed and upholstered in some blue washable fabric. Even the dark wooden prie-dieu was identical to the 100 others in the hostel. The Holy Father had stayed here as a cardinal before the Conclave had elected him pope, and had never moved out. One look at the luxurious apartment to which he was entitled in the Apostolic Palace, with its library and private chapel, had been enough to send him running. His war with the Vatican's old guard had started right there, on that issue, on the first day. When some of the heads of the Curia had demurred at his decision as not being appropriate for the dignity of a pope, he had quoted at them, as if they were schoolboys, Christ's instruction to his disciples. "Take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics. From then on, being human, they had felt his reproachful eye upon them every time they went home to their grand official apartments. And, being human, they resented it. The Secretary of State, Bellini, was standing by the desk with his back to the room. His term of office had ended with the breaking of a fisherman's ring, and his tall, thin, aesthetic frame, which he usually carried as erect as a Lombardy poplar, looked as if it had been snapped along with it. "My dear Aldo, I am so very sorry," Lomeli said. He saw that Bellini was examining the travelling chess set that the Holy Father used to carry around in his briefcase. He was running a long pale forefinger back and forth over the tiny red and white plastic pieces. They were crowded intricately together in the centre of the board, locked in some abstruse battle now destined never to be resolved. "Do you think anyone would mind if I took this as a keepsake?" "I'm sure not. We used to play quite often at the end of the day. He said it helped him relax." "Who won?" "He did, always." "Oh, take it. He loved you more than anyone. He would have wanted you to have it. Take it." "I suppose one should wait and ask for permission, but it appears that our zealous Camerlengo is about to seal the apartment." He nodded to where Tremblay and his priest assistants were gathered around the coffee table, laying out the materials he needed to affix to the doors. Red ribbons, wax, tape. Suddenly Bellini's eyes filled with tears. He had a reputation for coldness, the aloof and bloodless intellectual. Lomeli had never seen him show emotion. It shocked him. He put a hand on Bellini's arm. "What happened? Do you know?" "They say a heart attack." "I thought he had the heart of a bull." "No, not entirely, to be honest. There had been warnings." Huh? I had not heard that. Well, he didn't want anyone to know. He said the moment word got out, they'd start spreading rumours he was going to resign. They. Bellini did not have to spell out who they were. He meant the curia. For the second time that night, Lamelli felt obscurely slighted. Was that why he knew nothing of this long-standing medical problem? Because the Holy Father had thought of him not only as a manager, but as one of them? I think we shall have to be very careful what we say about his condition to the media. You know better than I what they are like. They will want to know about any history of heart trouble, and what exactly we did about it. And if it turns out it was all hushed up and we did nothing, they will demand to know why. Tell me, was anyone with the Holy Father when he died? Did he receive absolution? No, I'm afraid he was already dead when he was discovered. Gianno, I know this is hard for you, but we will need to prepare a detailed statement. Who discovered the Holy Father's body? I did, Your Eminence. Well, thank God, that's something. Of all members of the papal household, Wozniak was the one who'd been closest to the Pope, and it was comforting to think he'd been the first on the scene. Also, purely from a public relations point of view, better him than a security guard. Better him by far than a nun. What did you do? I called the Holy Father's doctor. And how quickly did he arrive? Immediately, Eminence. He always spent the night in the room next door. But there was nothing to be done. No. We had all the equipment necessary for resuscitation, but it was too late. You discovered him in bed? He was quite peaceful, almost as he looks now. I thought he was asleep. What time was this? Around 11:30, Eminence. 11:30? That was more than 2.5 hours ago. Lamelli's surprise must have shown in his face. I would have called you sooner, but Cardinal Tremblay took charge of the situation. Tremblay's head turned at the mention of his name. It was such a small room. He was only a couple of paces away. He was beside them in an instant. Despite the hour, his appearance was fresh and handsome, his thick silver hair immaculately coiffured, his body trim and carried lightly. He looked like a retired athlete who'd made a successful transition to television sports presenter. Lamelli vaguely remembered that he'd played ice hockey in his youth. The French-Canadian said, in his careful Italian, "I'm so sorry, Jacopo, if you feel offended by the delay in informing you. I know His Holiness had no closer colleagues than you and Aldo, but I felt as Camerlengo that my first responsibility was to secure the integrity of the Church. I told Gianno to hold off from calling you so that we could have a brief period of calm to ascertain all the facts. Ah, yes." The man was insufferable, Lamelli thought. "My dear Joe, my only concerns are for the soul of the Holy Father and the well-being of the Church. Whether I am told a thing at midnight or at 2 is neither here nor there as far as I am concerned. I am sure you acted for the best. It's simply that when a pope dies unexpectedly, any mistakes made in the initial shock and confusion can lead to all manner of malicious rumours afterwards. You have only to remember the tragedy of Pope John Paul I. We've spent the past 40 years trying to convince the world he wasn't murdered, all because nobody wanted to admit his body was discovered by a nun. There must be no discrepancies in the official account." From within his cassock he drew a folded sheet of paper and handed it to Lamelli. It was warm to the touch. Hot off the press, thought Lamelli. Neatly printed on a word processor, it was headed, in English, Timeline. Lamelli ran his finger down the columns of type. At 7:30 p.m. the Holy Father had eaten with Wozniak in the cordoned-off space reserved for him in the dining room of the Casa Santa Marta. At 8:30 he'd retired to his apartment and had read and meditated on a passage from the Imitation of Christ, chapter 8, of the Dangers of Intimacy. At 9:30 he had gone to bed. At 11:30 Archbishop Wozniak had checked to see that he was well, and had failed to observe any vital functions. At 11:34 Dr. Giulio Baldinotti, seconded from the Vatican's San Raffaele Hospital in Milan, commenced emergency treatment. A combination of cardiac massage and defibrillation was attempted, with no result. The Holy Father had been pronounced dead at 12:12 a.m. Cardinal Adeyemi came up behind Lomeli and began reading over his shoulder. The Nigerian always smelled strongly of cologne. Lomeli could feel his warm breath on the side of his neck. The power of man's presence was too much for him. He gave him the document and turned away, only to have more papers thrust into his hand by Tremblay. "What is all this?" "The Holy Father's most recent medical records. I had them brought over. This is an angiogram conducted last month, and you can see here, on this X-ray, evidence of blockage." The monochrome image was tendrilled, fibrous, sinister. Lomeli recoiled. What in God's name was the point of it? The Pope had been in his 80s. There was nothing suspicious about his passing. How long was he supposed to live? It was his soul upon which they should be focused at this moment, not his arteries. "Release the data if you must, but not the photograph. It is too intrusive. It demeans him." "I agree. And I suppose you will tell us next there will have to be an autopsy." "Well, there are bound to be rumours, if there is not." "This is true," said Bellini. "Once God explained all mysteries. Now he has been usurped by conspiracy theorists, the heretics of our age."
What was the Holy Father doing before 7:30?
Wozniak answered him. "He was celebrating Vespers, Eminence, here in the Casa Santa Marta."
Then we should say so. It was his last sacramental act, and it implies a state of grace, especially as there was no opportunity for the viaticum.
"That is a good point. I will add it to the list."
Going back further, before Vespers, what was he doing then?
"Routine meetings, as I understand it. I don't have all the facts. I was concentrating on the hours immediately before his death."
And going back further, the time before Vespers, what was he doing then?
"Routine meetings, as far as I understand it."
Was the last to have a scheduled meeting with him?
"Well, that would have been me, I think. I saw him at 4. Is that right, Giano? Was I the last?" "You were, Eminence."
And how was he when you spoke to him? Did he give any indication he was ill?
"No, none that I recall."
What about later, when he had dinner with you, Archbishop?
Wozniak looked at Tremblay as if seeking his permission before replying. He was tired, very, very tired. He had no appetite. I should have realized.
You have nothing to reproach yourself with.
Adeyemi returned the document to Tremblay and put his glasses back on. There was a careful theatricality to his movements. He was always conscious of his dignity. A true prince of the church.
But in all the meetings he had that day, to show how hard he was working right up to the end, it will prove there was no reason for anyone to suspect that he was ill.
On the contrary, isn't there a danger that if we release his full schedule, it'll look as if we were placing a huge burden on a sick man?
The papacy is a huge burden. People need to be reminded of that.
Tremblay frowned and said nothing. Bellini glanced at the floor. A slight but definite tension had arisen, and it took Lomeli a few moments to realize why. Reminding people of the immense burden of the papacy carried the obvious implication that it was an office best filled by a younger man, and Adeyemi, at just over 60, was nearly a decade younger than the other two. Eventually Lomeli said, "May I suggest that we amend the document to include the Holy Father's attendance at Vespers, but otherwise issue it as it stands, and that as a precaution we also prepare a second document listing the Holy Father's appointments for the entire day, and keep it in reserve in case it becomes necessary." Adeyemi and Tremblay exchanged brief looks, then nodded. Bellini said dryly, "Thank God for our Dean. I can see we may have need of his diplomatic skills in the days to come." Later, Lomeli would look back on this as the moment when the contest for the succession began. All three cardinals were known to have factions of supporters inside the Electoral College. Bellini, the great intellectual hope of the Liberals for as long as Lomeli could remember. a former rector of the Gregorian University, and former Archbishop of Milan. Tremblay, who, as well as serving as Camerlengo, was prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, a candidate therefore with links to the Third World, who had the advantages of seeming to be an American without the disadvantage of being one, and a Demi who carried himself like some divine spark, the revolutionary possibility, endlessly fascinating to the media, that he might one day become the first black pope. And slowly, as he observed the manoeuvring begin in the Casa Santa Marta, the realization came upon Lomeli that it would fall to him, as Dean of the College of Cardinals, to manage the election. It was a duty he had never expected to perform. He'd been diagnosed with prostate cancer a few years earlier, and although he'd supposedly been cured, he had always assumed he would die before the Pope. He had only ever thought of himself as a stopgap. He tried to resign. Now it seemed he would be responsible for the organization of a conclave in the most difficult of circumstances. If it is your will, O Lord, that I should have to discharge this duty, I pray that you will give me the wisdom to perform it in a manner that will strengthen our Mother the Church. He would have to be impartial, that first and foremost. He opened his eyes. Has anyone telephoned Cardinal Tedesco? No. Tedesco, of all people? Why? Do you think we need to? Well, given his position in the church, it would be a courtesy. A courtesy? Cried Bellini. What has he done to deserve courtesy? If any one man can be said to have killed the Holy Father, he did. Lomeli had sympathy for his anguish. Of all the Pope's critics, Tedesco had been the most savage, pushing his attacks on the Holy Father and on Bellini to the point, some thought, of schism. There had even been talk of excommunication. Nevertheless, he enjoyed a devoted following among the traditionalists, which was bound to make him a prominent candidate for the succession. Still, I should call him. It would be better if he hears the news from us rather than from some reporter. God knows what he might say off the cuff. He lifted the desk telephone from its cradle and pressed 0. An operator, a voice shaky with emotion, asked how she could help him. Please put me through to the Patriarch's Palace in Venice, to Cardinal Tedesco's private line. He assumed there'd be no answer. After all, it was not yet 3 a.m, but the phone didn't even finish its first ring before it was picked up. Tedesco? The other cardinals were talking quietly with one another about the timetable and the funeral. Lomeli held up his hand for silence and turned his back so he could concentrate on the call. Goffredo, it is Lomeli. I am afraid I have terrible news. The Holy Father has just passed away. There was a long pause. Lomeli could hear some sort of noise in the background. A footstep? A door? Patriarch, did you hear what I said? Tedesco's voice sounded hollow in the cavernous of his official residence. Thank you, Lomeli. I shall pray for his soul. Goffredo? The line had gone dead. He held the phone at arm's length and frowned at it. Well? He already knew. Are you sure? Tremblay took out what appeared to be a prayer book bound in black leather, but turned out to be a mobile phone. Of course he knew, said Bellini. This place is full of his supporters. He probably knew before we did. If we're not careful, he will make the official announcement himself, in St. Mark's Square. It sounded as though there was someone with him. Tremblay was stroking his screen rapidly with his thumb, scrolling through data. Oh, that's entirely possible. Rumours that the Pope is dead are already trending on social media. We shall have to move quickly. May I make a suggestion? And now came the second disagreement of the night, as Tremblay urged that the transfer of the Pope's body should take place straight away, rather than be delayed until the morning. We cannot allow ourselves to fall behind the news cycle. It'll be disaster. He proposed that the official announcement should be released at once, and that 2 film crews from the Vatican Television Centre, plus 3 pool photographers and a newspaper reporter, should be allowed into the Piazza Santa Marta to record the transfer of the body from the building to the ambulance. His reasoning was that if they moved quickly, the footage would be broadcast live and the church would be sure to have maximum exposure. In the great Asian centres of the Catholic faith it was morning. In Latin and North America, evening. Only the Europeans and the Africans would be obliged to wake up to the news. Again Adeyemi objected. For the sake of the dignity of the office, he argued, they should wait for daylight, and for a hearse and a proper casket that could be taken out draped with a papal flag. Bellini countered sharply. The Holy Father would not have cared a fig about dignity. It was as one of the humble of the earth that he chose to live, and it is as one of the humble poor that he would wish to be seen in death. Remember, Lamelli concurred, this was a man who refused to ride in a limousine. An ambulance is the nearest we can give him to public transport now. Nevertheless, Adeyemi would not change his mind. In the end, he had to be outvoted 3-1. It was also agreed that the Pope's body should be embalmed. But we must ensure it is done properly. Lamelli had never forgotten filing past Pope Paul VI's body in St. Peter's in 1978 in the August heat. The face had turned greyish-green, the jaw had sagged, and there was a definite whiff of corruption. Yet even the ghoulish embarrassment wasn't as bad as the occasion 20 years previously, when Pope Pius XII had fermented in its coffin and exploded outside the church of St. John Lateran. And another thing, we must make sure no one takes any photographs of the body. That indignity too had been inflicted upon Pius XII, whose corpse had been shown in news magazines all over the world. Tremblay went off to make the arrangements with the media office of the Holy See, and less than 30 minutes later the ambulance men, their phones confiscated, came and took the Holy Father out of the papal apartment in a white plastic body bag, strapped to a wheeled stretcher. They paused with it on the second floor, while the 4 cardinals went down ahead in the elevator so that they could meet it in the hotel lobby and escort it off the premises. The humility of the body in death, the smallness of it, the little rounded fetus shape of the feet and the head, seemed to Lamelli to make a profound statement. And he bought fine linen, and took him down, and wrapped him in the linen, and laid him in a sepulchre. The children of the Son of Man were all equal at the last, he reflected. All were dependent on God's mercy for the hope of resurrection. The lobby and the lower flight of the staircase were lined by religious of all ranks. It was their silence that imprinted itself indelibly on Lamelli's mind. When the elevator doors opened and the body was wheeled out, the only sound, to his dismay, was the click and whir of phone cameras, interspersed with an occasional sob. Tremblay and Adeyemi walked at the head of the stretcher, Lamelli and Bellini at the rear, with the prelates of the apostolic camera in a file behind them. They processed through the doors and into the October chill. There were even a few stars. They passed between the 2 Swiss guards and made towards a crucible of multicoloured light. The flashes of the waiting ambulances and its police escorts streaking like blue sunbeams around the rain-slicked piazza, the white strobe effect of the photographers, the engulfing yellow glare thrown up by the lamps of the TV crews, and behind all these, rising out of the shadows, the gigantic illuminated glow of St. Peter's. As they reached the ambulance, Lamelli tried to picture the universal church at that moment. Some 1.25 billion souls. The ragged crowds gathered around the television sets in the slums of Manila and Sao Paulo. The swarms of commuters in Tokyo and Shanghai, hypnotized by their mobile phones. The sports fans in the bars of Boston and New York, whose games were being interrupted. Go forth and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The body slid headfirst into the back of the ambulance. The rear door slammed. The 4 cardinals stood at solemn attention as the cortege pulled away. 2 motorcycles, then a police car, then the ambulance, then another police car, and finally more motorcycles. It swept around the piazza for a moment and disappeared. The instant it was out of sight, the sirens were switched on. So much for humility. So much for the poor of the earth. It could be the motorcade of a dictator. The wails of the cortege dwindled into the night. Behind the rope line, the reporters and photographers started calling out to the cardinals, like tourists at a zoo, trying to persuade the animals to come closer. "Your Eminence! Your Eminence! Over here!" "One of us should say something," said Tremblay, and without waiting for a response set off across the piazza. The lights seemed to impart a silhouette, like a fiery halo. Adeyemi managed to restrain himself for a few more seconds, and then went in pursuit. Bellini said, under his breath and with great contempt, "What a circus! Shouldn't you join them?" "God, no! I shan't pander to the mob. I think I would prefer to go to the chapel and pray." Something in his hand rattled. Lomeli saw he was holding the travelling chess set. "Come, join me. Let us say a mass for our friend together." As they walked back into the Casa Santa Marta, he took Lomeli's arm. "The Holy Father told me of your difficulties with prayer. Perhaps I can help. You know he had doubts himself by the end." "The Pope had doubts about God?" "Oh, no, not God, never about God. What he had lost faith in was the Church.